Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/securityweek. Hard-coded credentials can be trouble, but not as much trouble as a vulnerable DevOps environment. If you want protection without the hassle of security slowing you down, CyberArk, the #1 provider in privilege access security, has the solution for you. With CyberArk Conjur, developers can easily secure secrets across any DevOps toolchain or platform, whether your application runs in the cloud or on premises. Eliminate the headaches of managing secrets and try Conjur open source for free with no strings attached. Visit conjur.org/ASW to get started today.
Welcome back, everyone, for the application security news for the week of November 25th. Before we get started, one quick announcement. If you are interested in quality over quantity and having meaningful conversations instead of just a badge scan, join us April 1st to the 3rd at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. Use the registration code OS or Oscar Sierra 19-SecWeek for 15% off the main conference or world pass. With that, teeing this off, guys, USPS took over a year to fix a vulnerability that exposed over 60 million users' data. Yikes. I don't know, any comments from you guys right off the bat?
I want to say we covered some USPS stories about the service that they would take a picture of the package. I wasn't quite sure if it related to this one or like how that was being used. I did a disservice to our listeners on that story.
Keith, do you want to chime in on that, or do you want me to try to take this one? I believe that probably when you covered the story is when it broke by Brian Krebs.
Okay.
Right? Krebs on security, right? Yeah. So that broke about a year ago. Oh, and this is the follow-up where USPS finally came back and said we fixed it.
Interesting. Now, did it have something to do with the view my view my package? It sounds really bad.
I believe it's the API that exposes. So because I have that service, right? And actually, what's really interesting is this reminded me. I just moved, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do about. I can view all my mail, but now I changed address. So can I still do that to the new person?
So I guess the big piece missing for me was how do they authenticate who can view the picture of the package?
The trick is they didn't.
Okay.
In the past,
that's what it sounded like.
That's basically what the problem was. Is it was an API-based problem where there was authentication weakness. So effectively, you could call the API, and it sounded like it was maybe an insecure direct object reference. You could just change the ID that you wanted to look at, keep maybe your ID, and see other people's details. They didn't go into it the article very specifically, but it's basically the authentication mechanism related to the API request was like ridiculously weak.
Yeah, and I was confused as whether it was based on address and how the hackers were using the picture of the package to validate things. I didn't understand.
So I remember when I signed up for that service, I was very concerned about how easy it was for me to just authenticate that this was my mail.
That's the missing piece for me. Yeah, how do I claim that my address is my address and prove it to USPS? Or can anyone...
I think it may have something to do with the last 4 digits of your postal code. You know how you have like the postal code?
And then the dash. Yep.
I want to think that you had to put that in or something from a piece of your mail. And they may have done like, that open source credit check where it says like, hey, you purchased a car of this type in the last 10 years.
Yes.
And you have to pick. And you're like, well, I purchased 3 of those types of cars. And it's like...
Yeah.
But
you buy a lot of cars.
I think it may have been. I'm not saying that, but it may have something to do with that. Like I remember when I signed up, and it was so long ago, I don't remember. It was like anybody could have done this for my address.
I gotcha.
And this isn't the first story that Krebs broke that like I had kind of like looked at and then kind of wandered off after. So I don't know. Krebs and I need to talk sometime.
We need to get. Because we could be talking about 2 different attacks or something that was combined. Because there was definitely a story about they take a picture of your mail as it's going through a USPS office they send it to you. Yeah. And then you can look at it. And then, as Keith was describing, there was an open API that's been out there for a year that they haven't fixed.
And while we're talking about this, let's just I don't know if Krebs ever broke this part of the story or not, but I've noticed.
Pretty sure he did. In fact, this is why they ended up fixing it. It was when Krebs broke this part.
So I've noticed that when they scan my mail, I can actually see inside the envelope to like what's written on the document inside the envelope. It's like the lighting that they use to light up that envelope before they scan it, like is a see-through kind of a light.
Is that on purpose so you can see?
I don't think so. You're just supposed to be able to see the outside. Right. But I can actually see inside. So somebody signs up under your account, and then they can actually read your mail through the envelope without even receiving it.
Or see if there's a credit card in there.
So I don't know if Krebs ever mentioned that on his site, but I just like to throw that out there. You can read your own mail through the envelope through this service, or at least I have.
That sounds really bad.
Yeah, I mean, I could find some examples from my past mail that aren't like personal, and post some pictures somewhere so you can see this is. I'm not just making this up. I'm not crazy.
Well, so speaking of things not made up that are crazy, the other side of this as well, by the way, is that any user could request account changes for another user so that they could potentially change another account's email address, phone number, etc. Although, interestingly, apparently USPS does at least send a confirmation email to confirm the changes. So while necessarily it is protected from the stance that you got to confirm the change, you could perpetually just keep doing this to somebody and either spam their email inbox, or, you know, maybe if someone misses one of these confirmations and it just gets like defaulted to being okay after a certain period of time. It's just not great at all.
Informed visibility, is that what they call this service? That's what it's listed as here. They said, so the API allowed any user to convert regular USPS.com accounts into informed visibility business accounts, which couldn't impact companies like Netflix that get discounted rates for high volumes.
Interesting. Huh. Needless to say, a year to fix this? I mean, really? Like, that's just awful.
Yeah, that's just a sign of a lot of bad DevOps practices in my mind. I mean, you know, when you look at trends in the industry, you look at how long it takes a company, organization, or a person to fix a security bug that's been reported to them. You can see there's been a report put up by like Veracode, and I think there's been a few others in the industry. You can see a clear line of distinction. Okay, companies that have like CI/CD, DevOps, you know, containerized services and things like that, you know, they're fixing things from 1 day after reporting to like a month after reporting, and then there's a huge dip, and then you've got companies that are fixing things 3 months to a year or even 2 years after they're reported, and they're the ones that are like, okay, waterfall method, we got to build this, and then it gets QA tested, and then, you know, oh, that's after the requirements are written, and then, oh, then it gets deployed manually onto a server, blah, blah, blah. You know how that goes. I mean, that's like 10, 20 years ago, that's how things were deployed.
Still a lot of organizations to this day.
There are, yeah. And then that's where you see these trends on these charts that are put out even like just at Basque last month. I saw Veracode show this chart. And that's just like a sign of not using today's best practices. 2018, like let's get on board. Let's move things faster. So I'm not saying they're doing that, but I'm saying it's like a code smell. It's like a DevOps smell, if you will. I'm gonna coin that term right here.
Well, so one of the kind of strange things about all of this is it's the U.S. Postal Service, right? Like, they're not in the business of, you know, creating a whole lot of software, I think, right? Like, they probably don't have the biggest software development team in the world. And so you would think that because they're not developing a ton of things, either what they, you know, have is a very small development team, and therefore they weren't able to get back to this or didn't prioritize this appropriately, or they just have a very large development team. They're doing waterfall instead of, you know, DevOps processes, because this is the sort of thing from an API perspective that I can't imagine it would have been hard to architect in some form of authentication that would actually work for this, that they just either failed to do or weren't focusing on. So I don't know. It's like, you're the U.S. Postal Service. Like, how many other things could you possibly be working on? It's not like you need new features or what have you, right? You get paid not a whole lot based on your apps.
Yeah, but they very likely could have outsourced this too. And I also think USPS has to compete with FedEx and UPS and the other delivery services, so they do need to be forward thinking. However, them being a government institution and not a commercial institution, they're lagging behind on technology. Just because of the red tape. I think that you know, is the federal government. If you've ever read an article about the technology in FedEx or UPS, you know they're pretty advanced when it comes to technology. I remember reading articles years ago about, you know, that stuff. And when FedEx didn't know where my turkey was, I knew that they knew exactly where my turkey was. They just refused to tell me because my turkey didn't get delivered. It did eventually get delivered in time, but I'm like, if it's on the truck, they have the tracking number, they know which truck it is, and they know where that truck is.
Yeah, so interesting story. I used to work for UPS when I was in college. And this was like the early 2000s. So they had the tracking. They had a whole numbering system of where you put the box on. I used to load the trucks before they were delivered. And sometimes, like during Christmas season, I'd go out for delivery and actually deliver packages as well. And nowadays, I can see, because I know how the whole system works and the loading process, I can see they put a new sticker on there that tells you specifically which shelf inside the truck and what location to put it in. Like, but back then, they didn't have that, so you had to memorize for the trucks you loaded every day what the numbers were for each street and where they went in the truck. There's a whole technology thing that goes into that, like you know, more right turns than left turns, because right turns you don't have to wait for traffic to clear. And while I was working there, I was thinking, you know, wouldn't it be cool to work in the technology division of this company? But I never really got there because another job came along and I took off. So, but yeah, there's a lot of technology and computer stuff behind delivery services.
And clearly from this article that Keith put in there, it does not exist at the same level, or at least for this project. Like I said, they probably outsourced it, and that's how we're in this case of an API being exposed for a year.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That wouldn't surprise me at all, especially, you know, just spending the money rather than hiring the developers to do the work, because they've got other things, you know, such as building better delivery mechanisms, for example. And so needless to say, just as a total aside, the folks at USPS, by the way, do incredibly great work, especially during the holidays where they tend to work a lot, you know, delivering all of our packages. So, you know, hats off to them, because quite frankly, not only do they find things like, well, you know, a couple of months ago, all those bombs that were being sent around in the mail, but also they get the stuff that you want to you, which is pretty awesome.
I mean, most of the time, all providers, most of the time.
They do. Absolutely. I'm not putting down any of the delivery providers. It's because
I've had bad experiences with all of them. I mean, like he said, you think about how many packages are floating around.
It's crazy. I used to deliver them, so I know how hard work that is. I mean, you know, Christmas season, I'd be working, you know, 3 a.m., 2 a.m. probably until like 9 p.m., and then I'd be going back in for a 2 a.m. shift again. So, it's a lot of work. So hats off to them for sure.
So by the way, speaking of a lot of work, this whole Imagemagick thing, just keeps, you know, it's like the gift that keeps on giving. Talk about the holiday season. I know that, Brent, you were excited to talk about this, so feel free to dive in. But this write-up that we put on there for, that was, let's see here. If you build it, they will come. Story number 3, yet another memory leak in Imagemagick.
Right.
Yikes.
So there's 2 really exciting things about this story I really wanted to get into. The first one, so the title of it was very confusing to me. It says, yet another memory leak in Imagemagick. So as a C and C++ developer, I'm thinking, oh, memory leak. That's just like, you know, not allocating memory properly, not releasing it properly, and you're just consuming, your process consumes memory, and until you kill it, that memory is like gone. But this was actually more, the type of leak they're talking about is actually leaking memory that you should not be able to read. So
like Heartbleed,
so accessing memory outside of your process. So that's what they mean by memory leak in this title. But so I mean, that's how this exploit works. And Imagemagick has been like a center of, it's like Adobe Acrobat Reader. There's just like vulnerabilities coming out like on a weekly or bi-weekly basis for this tool. And I think that, you know, the thing we see, it's kind of an industry trend right now, is like containerized microservices. And I think that that's exactly what, this is like the golden example of why you need to start doing that. If you've got some kind of photo processing service running in your background and you want to use Imagemagick because, it's best of breed in terms of like command line or service resizing or reformatting a photo, it's the best tool. But you got to run in a container. You got to set it up as a microservice, and like put it off of your main web and application servers, because you don't want any vulnerabilities in this huge monolithic application to expose the rest of your stuff. So this is like the perfect example. Like containerized microservices, go for it. Absolutely.
The timeline on this was great too, because 2003 to 2015, only 40 CVEs. And I mean, only 40 is still a lot, right? 2016 is when the named vulnerability Imagemagick, which had RCE, server-side request forgery, and local file manipulation included, came out. There were 18 that year. Last year in 2017, there were 357 CVEs associated with Imagemagick. And so it's the same sort of problem where suddenly people start paying attention. Now in 2018, we've had 70 more CVEs against it, including this memory leak, as well as, of course, EPS processing with the Ghost script remote code execution attack as well. And, you know, needless to say, it's like, yeah, this is not great. And on top of that, one of the things that they actually say in the article itself, which I found both confusing and concerning, is toward the bottom of the article. They cite that Imagemagick is not frequently updated in official repositories, and that it's actually best to install stable Imagemagick versions from source code. Wow, like talk about antiquated. I don't know, maybe they have just a very bad deployment process of the downloads for the official repositories. But yet again, this is the sort of thing that it just, go back to the well some more, and it just continues to bear fruit in terms of really bad vulnerabilities, which in this case, it actually let you get like an image back that had bytes in it of the memory you were effectively going and stealing. So you just keep doing that, and you can effectively read all of the potential memory space in there. They actually cite later in the article how much of a memory space you could potentially read, which looks like it was 31,250 bytes, which would be like, what, 3.1 gigs ish? So yeah, that's a lot of memory you can read off of just one image coming back to you. So not good by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, I think it speaks to the state of open source in terms of security today. I think the reason we're seeing more vulnerabilities, I think there's more people looking for them. I think Heartbleed was kind of that turning point for the open source community, that they said, holy crap, we need to pay attention to this stuff. And they look to their right and look to their left, and they're like, there's nobody else to help me, so we need help with this problem. And I think whatever corporations or financial backing or governments really rely on open source software that maybe didn't realize it until something like a Heartbleed are now funding open source projects, and they're paying more attention to security and getting them the resources they need, which as a result, we were just talking about metrics on the show earlier, which is why you're seeing a lot more vulnerabilities, because there's more people looking for them and publishing them than there were before.
Interestingly, this is a really good segue into story number 1 under food for thought, which is DigitalOcean does a survey for developer trends. And this one was related to open source, basically use of open source and support of open source. Yeah. Now, Paul, I know how much you love surveys. So of course, take it for what it's worth, or take it with a grain of salt. But some of the stuff that they cover in here kind of gives me a little bit of pause, right? So in this case, one of the things that they cite is one of the barriers that a lot of developers are experiencing from getting involved in open source is they don't know where to begin, or they don't know if they have the right skills. The other side of this, though, is they do talk a little bit about how companies are expecting their developers to use open source, but not giving them time to contribute back to those projects that they're using. So I don't know if there was a lot of metrics in this one as well, in terms of
there were a lot of metrics in there, Keith. And that kind of ties into what I was just saying about containerized microservices, as 2 of the top 3, I believe, open source projects that people are most excited about were Docker and Kubernetes, which is kind of like a reinforcement of that trend that I just mentioned of containerized services, right? Which is awesome, because my experience with Kubernetes and Docker are they're still like a little bit difficult to use, but that can lead into things like what they call serverless services, right? So
functions as a service.
Amazon Lambda, I believe it's called, and there's a few other services.
Azure Functions, yep.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, we all know it is running on a server. You just don't have to worry about that server. That's not you got the cloud services. Oh, you don't have to worry about the infrastructure. okay, well now it's serverless. You don't have to worry about the server. You just have to worry about your software. It's like we're getting to that point, and I mean, it's all good. It has its own cons. You got to evaluate the risk for your own organization and say, okay, where do we fit into this whole hierarchy of services that we can purchase instead of support ourselves? But you know, at the end of the day, they're gonna probably sometimes do a better job of securing stuff than you can. So
we gotta remember though, you can't just keep moving the problem around, right? Like I can take that vulnerable application, I can put it in a VM that lives inside of a container, and then I can put it in a serverless environment. I can put a WAF in front of it. However, at the end of the day, my code is still terrible and probably has bugs.
Still lets you get everybody's details out of it.
Exactly. My app is still vulnerable. And while I agree we've got much better tools today than we probably ever have before to be able to containerize and segment and properly design it, and then when you do, you realize that there's a lot more configuration that goes into it. But we do, I agree, have the tools to say in my application, in fact, we're getting ready to do this with our own application. If I have a component that is nicely packaged inside of an additional container, like Imagemagick, it does limit your risk, right? But it doesn't, unfortunately, fix that vulnerable code. We were talking about this last week with John Kinsella about taking vulnerable Windows applications and moving them into containers. And we kind of debated, like, yes, that's a good thing for a lot of reasons, but it also doesn't fix the code.
No, you're absolutely right. And like I'm one of, like, in that list of people that's going to take advantage of that. I'm on that list. I'm one of those people, right? So I'm looking for that kind of stuff. And so you have to fix the root cause of the problem, which is training your developers on application security risks, which is something I would love to talk about, but I know that we're
also too, the technical debt you could have incurred, technical security debt in this case of Imagemagick, was probably, after Keith read it off, really, really big, right? Because it sounds like they started finding vulnerabilities and they're like, oh, we need to really look for vulnerabilities before we added in new features. And lo and behold, in a year, they found something like 300, Keith said, and that was them catching up on their technical debt.
Sure.
And just as a total aside, right? Like I'm going off the rails a little bit here, and I don't mean Ruby on Rails. I was actually really excited to see in the top 10 list, by the way, for the things that are open source projects that their developers really enjoyed over the last 3 years. React was the top, React.js, followed by Kubernetes, Docker, and Linux, which I thought was pretty cool. What I'm surprised, though, by was after TensorFlow, they have Vue.js on there at number 6. What shocks me about that is Vue.js is like very, very new to the scene. It's only really taken off in like maybe the last 8 to 10 months. So that was kind of surprising to me to see that many people supporting it above and beyond, say, Laravel or Angular or Python or Ruby on Rails.
Yeah.
And that's, and that could be selection bias too, Keith.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Because did DigitalOcean poll their users?
Yeah. So it was developers of open source projects of their own. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a subset of users, if you think about it, that are going to actually use DigitalOcean as opposed to, say, maybe a competitor Heroku versus Amazon versus Azure, especially if you're a larger enterprise, right? What's interesting to me, though, as well about some of this stuff was in terms of languages, they also cited JavaScript and Python kind of being the big two, which tends to mean that, at least for the development body there, because there was 62 and 52% accordingly. So basically, if you're using maybe more than one language, they were reporting in multiple languages. That those people that are doing JavaScript and Python are usually out on the bleeding edge of prototyping things and not using, traditional applications like, I don't know, something written in Java or a PHP, like a WordPress or a Drupal. So it gives you kind of an idea as to who's using this sort of thing, which would lead to smaller companies, people that are doing prototyping, startups, stuff of that nature.
Agreed.
Different body of people.
Keith, can I just mention the one kind of somewhat scary statistic I saw in this report, which was only 30% of the people or organizations using open source software assess the security of the tools when vetting the technology they're using. So I'm sorry, that's just scary. I don't even have a comment to that.
I actually think that's pretty high based on their selection of the audience.
Okay,
right?
That's a fair assessment.
It's probably much lower depending on who you ask, right? If you were to ask for enterprise developers that have implemented open source who's looked at the security, I would expect that number to be even lower.
Okay.
Yeah, even more scary.
But that's scary to me too.
It is scary. I know.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that we're looking at but I just know that's how it works. Nobody looks at the security of stuff these days.
Well, then you got to ask the skill level of those people assessing the security.
Right,
and then
yeah,
ask them how many bugs they found, right? Like, 30% could look at it, but what percentage of those people would find a higher number or lower number of bugs, based on their skill set?
Oh, man, and that ties into something I read this week about how do you even assess the qualifications of a company you hired to pen test you?
That's a good
right?
way. Yeah, I mean, we talk about third-party or vendor risk assessments, right? And that's a really good question.
Oh man, that's a whole hour segment right there,
It
Keith.
is.
So put that on the list for someday.
Yeah, that's a good Ball Security Weekly segment. I like it.
I was going to say, speaking of assessing the risk, story number 2 under the bugs, breaches, and more, a second WordPress hacking campaign is underway, this time for one of their plugins, the AMP plugin, which is apparently pretty popular. Yet another situation where this is a follow-on bug or a follow-on campaign. So what they ended up having here is the AMP for WordPress vulnerability is a cross-site scripting related bug, but it's similar to the WordPress GDPR compliance plugin that attackers were also going after to take site-wide control of websites via that plugin as well. And by the way, imagine how many people are using GDPR compliance plugins these days. Like probably a ton of people. Did we mention, by the way, I know that a few weeks ago, Paul, you and I talked about how WordPress 5.7 was going end of life, December 31st this year, and a lot of WordPress lives on that. Yeah, we're going to be in a bad state. I get the feel like 2019 is going to be a really good year, Brent, for folks like, you and I who like to hack on these things, because we're going to get so many 0 days that are never going to be patched.
Yeah. And you know what was really cool about this story, Keith? I mean, the person who's doing this is thinking like me, because not only did they exploit the bug and kind of add a super admin user into the database for WordPress, although they called the new admin user support user, which I think maybe was a typo. Maybe they meant to put support user, but they didn't know how to spell it. So yeah, that's something I would have done. But B, something I would have done, they automatically inject backdoors into other WordPress plugins that are loaded onto the site so they can access the site again if somebody deletes that user. And now we're talking, this is not basic exploiting code. This is okay, next level, I'm going to figure out more ways to get into the site. And that just registers with my brain as this is exactly what I would have done if I was on this campaign. So yeah, it's cool and it's bad all at the same time. I have that conflict of interest in my brain.
I think it's kind of interesting that if you want your site to have AMP features, which apparently is a Google project that makes for a seamless and faster mobile experience, that you'd be like, oh, the conclusion that we all come to, everyone that runs WordPress, to get that I just could install a plugin. Right, where as I dig into it a little bit, and I'm not entirely certain on this, but I would think that if your theme is coded very well and has good features, that it could be, it could support AMP without a plugin.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But then it begs the question: if I've got a crappy theme and it has vulnerabilities, or something that's kind of bleeding edge like this, can it have vulnerabilities inside of your theme, which is also the root cause of some vulnerabilities in WordPress over the years as well.
Yeah, and this one, Paul, to your point, was the accelerated mobile pages, which is now referred to as AMP for WordPress, which, it's just one of those situations where that has effectively been, for the longest time, kind of the Achilles heel of WordPress has almost always been the plugins, right?
Yeah.
The core set of WordPress at this point is getting pretty solid. But the plugin environment, I mean, everyone that uses
plugins
WordPress,
and the themes too. And the reason you would, we've run WordPress for a long time. Fortunately, we don't have any sensitive data on our website, which is why we run WordPress, right? Is that if your answer is install a plugin, you're like, I don't want to do that. But then your next answer might be, well, you just need to update your theme. And that, having done that several times over, that can be a multi-month or year-long project, depending on how invested you are in your theme, which is why it leads WordPress users back to, I just install a plugin, which is why so many people run plugins and they're vulnerable because the developers aren't building security into it from the ground up.
That's almost a perfect segue to our, of course, weekly commit strip, one final detail. So that is story number 3 under food for thought. That's wiki.securityweekly.com/ASW_episode 41. I think our readers, or listeners, I should say, will enjoy reading that one because it's kind of the exact problem that you just described, Paul. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git, commit, and stay classy.